Welcome to wooEnglish, where we teach English through captivating stories from history. In today's video, we dive into the dramatic and emotional life of Julius Caesar, his rise to power, his greatest triumphs, and the betrayal that led to his downfall. Our goal is to help you improve your English skills while enjoying fascinating stories like this one. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and subscribe for more engaging content. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Young Julius. Julius Caesar was born in a time of war and uncertainty. Rome was a powerful city, a place of legends and glory, but it was also full of danger. The streets of Rome were alive with the sound of soldiers' boots marching on stone, the clanging of swords, and the whispers of politics. Rome was a city always on the edge, ready for the next battle, the next fight for power. As a young boy, Julius would watch the soldiers march through the streets. He would stand in the crowd, his eyes wide with admiration and longing. The soldiers were strong, brave, and they carried the weight of Rome's future on their shoulders. Julius could see their shiny armor, their red cloaks flowing behind them like a wave of power. He dreamed of wearing that armor, of leading those men, of becoming a great leader, a hero of Rome. But life was not easy for young Julius. His family, the Julii, was noble, but they had lost much of their power. They were respected, yes, but they were no longer rich. Julius's father, Gaius Julius Caesar, had tried to restore the family's honor, but he faced many challenges. And then, when Julius was just 16 years old, tragedy struck. One cold morning, as the first light of dawn touched the city, Julius received the news that would change his life forever. His father, his strong, proud father, was dead. The news hit him like a thunderbolt. Julius felt the ground beneath him shift. Everything seemed to fall apart. He was just a boy, but suddenly he was the head of his family. It was now up to him to protect his mother, Aurelia, and his sisters. He had to be strong. He had to be brave. But could he do it? Could he be the man his father wanted him to be? Julius was determined. He could not show fear, not to his family, not to anyone. He took a deep breath, and with that breath, he made a decision that would shape his future. Julius would not let his family fall into ruin. He would restore their honor, their name. He would become someone great, someone his father would be proud of. But how? How could he do it? Julius knew that Rome respected strength, courage, and power. And where did one find power in Rome? In the army. On the battlefield. That was where heroes were made. That was where he would prove himself. Julius spoke with his mother, Aurelia, a wise and strong woman. She had always supported him, always believed in him. She understood his ambition, his dreams, but she also worried. She knew the dangers of the army, the risks. She had already lost her husband. Could she bear to lose her son too? But Aurelia saw the fire in Julius's eyes, the determination in his voice. She knew she could not hold him back. She knew he had to follow his destiny. "Julius," she said softly, "if this is what you must do, then do it with all your heart. Be brave, be strong, and never forget where you come from. Never forget your family." Julius nodded, his heart filled with both excitement and fear. He knew the path ahead would not be easy, but he was ready. He was ready to become the man he was meant to be. And so, Julius joined the army. He left his home, his family, and stepped into a world of blood, sweat, and iron. The first days were hard, very hard. The training was brutal. The soldiers were tough, and they showed no mercy. Julius had to push his body to the limit, had to learn to fight, to survive. Every day he faced new challenges, new fears. But with every challenge, he grew stronger, more determined. Julius quickly showed his skill in battle. He was not the strongest soldier, but he was smart. Very smart. He knew how to think, how to plan. He studied his enemies, learned their weaknesses, and when the time came, he struck, fast and hard. His fellow soldiers began to notice. They saw that Julius was not just another young recruit. He was a leader, a man with a future. But Julius did not only learn the art of war on the battlefield. He learned how to lead men, how to inspire them, how to make them follow him. He listened to the stories of the older soldiers, men who had fought in many battles. He learned from their experience, their wisdom. Julius knew that if he was going to be a great leader, he had to understand the men who would follow him. He had to earn their respect. And respect him they did. Julius's bravery, his intelligence, and his determination earned him the loyalty of his men. They began to trust him, to look to him for guidance. Julius was becoming more than just a soldier. He was becoming a leader. But deep inside, Julius's ambition burned brighter than ever. He knew that being a good soldier was not enough. Not for him. He wanted more, much more. He wanted to rise through the ranks, to become a commander, a general. He wanted to lead Rome's armies, to conquer new lands, to make Rome greater than ever before. Julius's mind was always thinking, always planning. He knew that his path to power would not be easy. There would be enemies, many enemies. But Julius was not afraid. He had faced fear before, and he had overcome it. He knew that if he was going to achieve his dreams, he had to be strong. Stronger than anyone else. As the years passed, Julius continued to rise. He fought in many battles, and each time he became more famous, more respected. His name began to be known throughout Rome. People started to talk about him, to wonder who this young soldier was and what he might become. But Julius knew that this was just the beginning. He had a long way to go and many challenges to face, but he was ready. He was ready to fight, to struggle, to do whatever it took to reach his goal. Julius Caesar was no longer just a young boy dreaming of glory. He was a man with a vision, a man with a destiny, and he would stop at nothing to achieve it. The path ahead was full of danger, full of uncertainty. But Julius was not afraid. He had made his choice, and he would follow it to the end. Rome was waiting, and so was Julius. The future was calling, and he was ready to answer. And so, the young Julius Caesar took his first steps on the road to greatness, a road that would lead him to the highest heights of power, and ultimately to his greatest triumphs and his deepest tragedies. The story of Julius Caesar had just begun, and it was a story that would change the world forever. You've just listened to the story of Julius Caesar's early years, his dreams, his struggles, and his first steps toward greatness. Now, it's time to see what you remember. I'm going to ask you a few questions about what you've just heard. Take a moment to think about your answers, and when you're ready, write them down in the comments below. What was Julius Caesar's dream when he was a young boy? What did he want to become? Chapter 2. The Soldier. Julius Caesar joined the Roman army filled with determination and a hunger for greatness. He was young, but there was something in his eyes, something fierce, something that made others take notice. Julius was not just another soldier. He was a leader in the making. From the very beginning, Julius showed his skill in battle. He was quick to learn, always observing, always thinking. When others were tired, he pushed harder. When others were afraid, he stood firm. Julius knew that the army was not just about strength. It was about strategy, about knowing when to strike and how to win. The first battles were tough. The enemy was fierce, the conditions brutal. But Julius fought with everything he had. In the heat of battle, when the swords clashed and the shields splintered, Julius was there, leading his men, inspiring them. He was smart, brave, and his soldiers loved him. Julius was not just a soldier, he was a tactician. He studied his enemies, learned their weaknesses, and exploited them with precision. His mind was always working, always planning the next move. He knew that in war, victory belonged not just to the strong, but to the clever. But Julius was not satisfied with just winning battles. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted to be respected. Every victory, every triumph, was a step towards his goal. And with each battle, his fame grew. People started to talk about the young soldier who led with such courage, such wisdom. Julius Caesar was becoming a name that everyone knew and feared. In one battle, Julius and his men were surrounded by the enemy. The situation was dire, the odds against them. But Julius did not panic. He did not lose hope. Instead, he rallied his men, spoke to them with fire in his voice, and led them in a daring charge that broke through the enemy lines. The men followed him without question, trusting him with their lives. And because of Julius, they won a victory that seemed impossible. Julius knew that leadership was not just about giving orders. It was about earning the trust and loyalty of your men. He fought alongside them, shared their hardships, and never asked them to do something he would not do himself. The soldiers respected him. They admired him. To them, Julius was more than just a commander. He was a hero. As Julius continued to fight, he gained more experience, more knowledge. He learned the art of war from the greatest generals of Rome. He studied their tactics, understood their strategies, and then he improved upon them. Julius was not content with just following orders. He wanted to create his own path, to carve out his own destiny. But the road to greatness was not easy. Julius faced many challenges, many dangers. There were times when defeat seemed certain, when death was just a breath away. But Julius never gave up, never surrendered. He fought with everything he had, and each time he came out stronger, more determined. One of the most important battles in Julius's early career took place in Asia Minor, against the fierce tribes of the region. The enemy was ruthless, attacking with speed and brutality. Many Roman soldiers were afraid, unsure if they could win. But Julius stood tall, his eyes blazing with confidence. He told his men, "We will win this battle. "We will show them the strength of Rome." And win they did. Julius led his men into the heart of the enemy forces, his sword flashing in the sunlight, his voice ringing out above the noise of battle. The enemy tried to resist, but they could not stand against the force of Julius and his men. The battle was fierce, but in the end, Julius was victorious. After the battle, the men cheered his name, their voices echoing across the battlefield. "Caesar! Caesar!" they shouted, lifting him on their shoulders. Julius felt a swell of pride, a sense of triumph, but he knew that this was just the beginning. There were still many battles to fight, many challenges to overcome, and Julius was ready for them all. Julius's victories did not go unnoticed. Word of his bravery and skill spread throughout Rome. The people began to speak of him with admiration, and the leaders of Rome started to pay attention. Who was this young soldier, they wondered, who fought with such brilliance? Julius Caesar was becoming more than just a soldier. He was becoming a symbol of Rome's power. But Julius did not let the fame go to his head. He knew that there was still much to learn, much to achieve. He continued to fight, continued to lead his men with courage and wisdom. Each battle was a new opportunity to prove himself, to show the world what he was capable of. As Julius's fame grew, so did his responsibilities. He was given command of more soldiers, more battles. But no matter how large his army grew, he never lost sight of the men who followed him. He knew that his strength came from them, from their loyalty and trust. Julius treated his men with respect, with care. He knew their names, their stories, and because of this, they would follow him anywhere, even into the jaws of death. Julius's rise in the army was swift. He became a tribune, then a commander, leading entire legions of Roman soldiers. His success on the battlefield was unmatched, his strategies brilliant. But Julius knew that war was not just about fighting. It was about winning hearts and minds. He made alliances with local leaders, showed mercy to the conquered, and built a reputation not just as a warrior, but as a leader of men. Julius fought in many battles, each one more difficult than the last, but each time he emerged victorious, his fame growing with every triumph. He was becoming one of Rome's most respected generals, a man who could lead Rome to greatness. But even as he climbed higher, Julius never forgot where he came from, never forgot the dream that had driven him from the beginning. The soldier who had joined the army as a young man was now a leader, a commander who was loved by his men and feared by his enemies. Julius had proven himself on the battlefield, had shown the world that he was more than just a name. He was a force to be reckoned with. But deep inside, Julius's ambition burned brighter than ever. He had conquered much, but he wanted more. He dreamed of greater battles, of greater victories. He dreamed of Rome, not just as a city, but as an empire. And he knew that he was the one who could make that dream a reality. Julius Caesar, the soldier, had risen through the ranks. He had fought with courage, led with wisdom, and earned the respect of all who knew him. But his journey was far from over. The path ahead was filled with challenges, with dangers, but also with opportunities. And Julius was ready to seize them all. The soldier, who had once been just another face in the crowd, was now a man of destiny. And his story, the story of Julius Caesar, was only just beginning. You've just listened to the story of Julius Caesar's time as a soldier his battles, his leadership, and the way he earned the respect of his men. Now, it's time to test your memory. I'm going to ask you a few questions about what you've just heard. Think carefully about your answers, and when you're ready, write them down in the comments below. How did Julius Caesar quickly prove himself as a soldier? What qualities made him stand out? Chapter 3. The Ambitious Politician. Julius Caesar returned to Rome as a hero. After years of fighting on distant battlefields, after leading his soldiers to victory after victory, he was finally back, and the city welcomed him with open arms. The people lined the streets, cheering his name. "Caesar! Caesar!" Their voices filled the air, echoing through the city like a mighty roar. Julius felt their love, their power. As he rode through the streets in his chariot, he could see the admiration in their eyes, the respect they had for him. It was intoxicating. It was everything he had ever wanted. But as the cheers grew louder, so did Julius's ambition. He knew that being a hero was not enough. He wanted more, much more. Julius was not content with just basking in the glory of his military victories. He wanted to rule. He wanted to be the one who shaped Rome's future, who guided it to even greater heights. But to do that, he needed more than just a sword. He needed power, real power. And in Rome, power was found in politics. Julius became a politician. He was clever with words, able to sway the crowds with his speeches, able to charm the Senate with his wit. But Julius knew that politics was not just about speaking well. It was about making alliances, about knowing who to trust and who to fear. One of the first things Julius did was to make powerful friends. He knew he could not rise to the top alone. He needed allies, men who could help him achieve his goals. And so, he turned to two of the most powerful men in Rome, Pompey and Crassus. Pompey was a great general, almost as famous as Julius himself. He had many followers, and his name was known throughout Rome. Crassus, on the other hand, was one of the richest men in the city. He had wealth beyond imagination, and with wealth came influence. Together, these three men formed the first triumvirate, a group of three leaders who controlled Rome's most important decisions. With Pompey's military strength, Crassus's wealth, and Julius's ambition, they were unstoppable. But even as Julius worked with Pompey and Crassus, he never forgot his own ambitions. He wanted more than just a share of power. He wanted it all. Julius was always thinking, always planning. He knew that his alliance with Pompey and Crassus was just the beginning. To truly rule Rome, he would need to be patient and very, very clever. Julius started by winning the support of the people. He knew that the people of Rome were the key to his success. If they loved him, if they believed in him, he could use that power to bend the Senate to his will. So, Julius began to pass laws that helped the poor, that gave land to soldiers, that made life better for ordinary Romans. The people cheered for him, loved him even more. They saw Julius as their champion, their hero. But Julius was also making enemies. The Senate, the group of powerful men who had ruled Rome for centuries, began to fear him. They saw how the people loved him, how his power was growing. They whispered behind closed doors, plotting against him. But Julius was always one step ahead. He knew how to play the game of politics, how to outmaneuver his opponents. As the years passed, Julius's power continued to grow. He became the governor of Gaul, a vast region to the north of Rome. This was a great opportunity for Julius. As governor, he could command his own army, make his own decisions, and most importantly, win more victories. And win he did. Julius led his army into Gaul, fighting battle after battle, conquering tribe after tribe. His fame grew even greater, his name spoken with awe and fear. The people of Rome heard of his victories, of the lands he had conquered, and their love for him grew even stronger. But while Julius was in Gaul, trouble was brewing back in Rome. The alliance between Julius, Pompey, and Crassus began to fall apart. Crassus was killed in battle, and Pompey started to see Julius as a threat. The two former allies began to drift apart, their friendship turning into rivalry. Pompey had the support of the Senate, while Julius had the loyalty of his soldiers and the love of the people. Julius knew that a conflict with Pompey was inevitable. He could feel the tension in the air, the sense that something big was about to happen. But Julius was not afraid. He had faced danger before, had overcome impossible odds. He was ready to face whatever came next. The Senate, fearing Julius's growing power, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. They thought they could strip him of his power, force him back into the role of a simple politician. But Julius was not a man to be controlled. He saw their command for what it was, a trap. They wanted to weaken him, to make him vulnerable. But Julius had his own plans. In a bold and daring move, Julius did something that would change the course of history. He took his army and marched towards Rome. But before crossing the Rubicon River, the boundary of Italy, Julius paused. He knew that once he crossed that river, there would be no turning back. It would be war. Civil war. Julius stood at the edge of the river, his thoughts racing. He could feel the weight of the moment, the tension in the air. But Julius was a man of action, a man of destiny. He looked at his soldiers, saw their trust in him, and made his decision. With a calm but powerful voice, he declared, "The die is cast." And then he crossed the Rubicon. The march on Rome began, and with it, the final struggle for power. Pompey and the Senate fled the city, afraid of Julius's unstoppable advance. The people of Rome, who had always loved him, welcomed him with open arms. Julius had done the unthinkable. He had taken control of Rome by force, and now he was its ruler. But Julius knew that this victory was not the end. It was just the beginning of a new and dangerous chapter. The road ahead was full of challenges, full of dangers. Pompey was not defeated yet, and there were still many in the Senate who wanted to see Julius fall. But Julius was ready. He had come too far, fought too hard, to be stopped now. He would face whatever came next with the same determination, the same ambition that had brought him this far. Julius Caesar, the ambitious politician, was on the path to becoming the most powerful man in the world. And so the stage was set for the final act of Julius's rise to power. The battles, the betrayals, the victories, and the defeats, all of it would lead to a dramatic and unforgettable conclusion. But for now, Julius stood at the height of his power, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. The world was his, and he would stop at nothing to rule it. Now, it's time to test your understanding. I'm going to ask you a few questions about what you've just heard. Think about your answers, and when you're ready, write them down in the comments below. What was Julius Caesar's main goal when he returned to Rome after his military victories? What did he want to achieve as a politician? Chapter 4. Crossing the Rubicon. Rome was full of tension, a city on the edge. Julius Caesar had become too powerful, too dangerous. The Senate, the group of men who ruled Rome, watched him with growing fear. They knew Julius was not just a general anymore. He was a force that could change everything. The Senate could see that Julius was loved by the people, respected by his soldiers, and feared by his enemies. They saw how his power grew with each victory, how his name echoed through the streets of Rome. And they were afraid that Julius wanted to be more than just a leader, that he wanted to be a king. Rome had no place for kings. Rome was a republic ruled by the Senate. But with Julius's growing power, that balance was in danger. The Senate decided they had to act. They sent a message to Julius, ordering him to give up his army and return to Rome, alone. They wanted to strip him of his power, to make him vulnerable, to control him. But Julius was not a man who could be controlled. When Julius received the Senate's orders, he knew what it meant. They were trying to trap him, to force him into a corner where he would be powerless. But Julius was too clever for that. He knew that if he returned to Rome without his army, he would be at their mercy. And mercy was something the Senate did not have. Julius refused. He would not give up his army, the men who had fought with him, bled with him, and followed him through every battle. His army was his strength, his power. Without them, he was nothing. But with them, he was unstoppable. But Julius knew the choice he was making was a dangerous one. By refusing the Senate's order, he was challenging their authority, challenging Rome itself. The consequences would be severe. There would be no going back. It would be war. On a cold, gray day in January, Julius stood at the edge of the Rubicon River. The water flowed quietly. The air was still, but the moment was heavy with tension. This was the boundary of Italy, the line that no general was supposed to cross with an army. To do so was a declaration of war against Rome. Julius knew that if he crossed this river with his army, everything would change. He would be committing an act of rebellion, of defiance. It was a point of no return. Once he crossed, there would be no turning back. He would either win everything or lose everything. Julius looked at his men, the soldiers who had followed him for so long. They stood with him, their eyes full of trust, of loyalty. They were ready to follow him anywhere, even into the unknown. They knew the risks, but they also knew their leader. They believed in him, believed in his vision, his strength, and they were ready to fight for him, to the very end. The silence was thick, the moment stretched like a bowstring pulled tight. Julius felt the weight of history pressing down on him, the eyes of Rome watching, waiting. He knew that this decision would define him, would define everything that came after. But Julius was not a man who hesitated. He was a man of action, of boldness. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs, and then he made his choice. "The die is cast," Julius said, his voice calm but filled with determination. And then, with steady steps, he led his army across the Rubicon. The soldiers followed, their feet splashing in the cold water, their hearts pounding with the excitement and the fear of what was to come. They knew that this was not just another march. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The world would change with this crossing, and they were part of it. As they reached the other side, Julius felt a surge of energy, of purpose. He had made his choice, and now there was no going back. He had crossed the Rubicon, and with it, he had crossed into a new reality. War was coming, and Julius was ready. Word of Julius's crossing spread like wildfire. Rome was in shock. The Senate panicked, realizing that they had underestimated Julius, that they had pushed him too far. They knew now that they were facing a man who would not back down, who would not be controlled. Julius Caesar had declared war on Rome itself. The Senate quickly rallied their forces, calling on Pompey, Julius's old ally, to lead the defense of Rome. Pompey was a great general, respected and experienced, but even he knew that facing Julius would be no easy task. Julius was not just a general. He was a force of nature, a man who seemed destined for greatness. The city of Rome buzzed with fear and excitement. People whispered in the streets, wondering what would happen next. Some were terrified of the coming war, others thrilled by the drama of it all. But everyone knew one thing: Rome would never be the same again. Julius marched his army towards Rome, his heart set on victory. He knew the risks, knew that he was walking a dangerous path, but he also knew that he could not turn back. He had crossed the Rubicon, and now he had to see this through to the end. As he marched, Julius thought of all that had brought him to this moment: the battles he had fought, the victories he had won, the men who had followed him. He thought of the power he had gained, the love of the people, the respect of his soldiers. But he also thought of the enemies he had made, the dangers that lay ahead. The road was uncertain, but Julius was certain of one thing: he would fight for his future, for Rome's future, no matter the cost. The days passed, the tension grew. Julius and his army moved closer to Rome, the city that had once cheered his name, that had once loved him. But now, it was a city divided, a city in fear. And then, the final moment came. Julius stood before the gates of Rome, his army behind him, ready for battle. The city was silent, waiting, holding its breath. Julius knew that this was the moment of truth. Everything he had worked for, everything he had dreamed of, was within his reach. But he also knew that the cost would be high, that there would be no easy victories. But Julius was ready. He had crossed the Rubicon, had chosen his path, and now he would walk it to the end. With a heart full of determination, with a mind clear and focused, Julius Caesar prepared to take the next step into history. The gates opened, and Julius entered Rome, not as a conqueror, but as a man with a vision, a man with a destiny. The road ahead was full of challenges, full of dangers, but also full of possibilities, and Julius was ready to face them all. For he had crossed the Rubicon, and there was no turning back. The die was cast, and the world would never be the same. Now, it's time to test your memory. I'm going to ask you a few questions about what you've just heard. Think carefully about your answers, and when you're ready, write them down in the comments below. How did Julius Caesar quickly prove himself as a soldier? What qualities made him stand out? Chapter 5. The Civil War. War broke out in Rome. The streets that once echoed with the sounds of daily life were now filled with the cries of fear and the clash of swords. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, and there was no turning back. The city was divided, torn between those who supported Julius and those who stood with Pompey, his old ally turned rival. Pompey was no ordinary opponent. He was a seasoned general, respected and admired by many. He had the support of the Senate and a large part of Rome's army. But Julius had something even more powerful. He had the loyalty of his soldiers, the love of the people, and a will of iron. The first battles were fierce. The land was stained with blood as brother fought against brother, Roman against Roman. Julius led his troops with unmatched skill, his mind sharp, his resolve unshakable. He knew that this war was not just about power, it was about the future of Rome. He fought not just for himself, but for the vision he had of a stronger, united Rome. Julius's soldiers followed him with unwavering loyalty. They trusted him, believed in him. In every battle, Julius was there, at the front, leading the charge. His presence inspired his men, gave them courage in the face of overwhelming odds. They would do anything for him. Fight, bleed, die. The battles raged on, each one more brutal than the last. Julius's forces clashed with Pompey's in towns, in fields, in the very heart of Italy. The sound of swords striking shields, of horses charging, of men shouting in the heat of battle filled the air. The land itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the conflict. But Julius was unstoppable. He won battle after battle. His strategies brilliant, his leadership unmatched. He outmaneuvered Pompey at every turn, striking where his enemy least expected it, always staying one step ahead. Julius's mind was a weapon as sharp as any sword, and he wielded it with deadly precision. Pompey tried to regroup, to gather his forces and strike back. He retreated to Greece, hoping to build a stronger army there, but Julius was relentless. He followed Pompey across the sea, determined to finish what he had started. The war had spread beyond Rome, beyond Italy. It had become a battle for the very soul of the Roman Empire. In Greece, the two armies met in one of the most decisive battles of the war, the Battle of Pharsalus. The tension was unbearable, the stakes higher than ever. Both sides knew that this battle could determine the future of Rome. Julius's soldiers, though outnumbered, fought with the strength of lions, driven by their loyalty to their leader. The battle was fierce, the outcome uncertain. The sun beat down on the battlefield, the dust rising in thick clouds as the armies clashed. Julius, as always, was in the thick of it, leading his men, directing the battle with a calm and steady hand. His eyes missed nothing, his mind calculating every move, every possibility. And then, the tide turned. Julius's tactics outmatched Pompey's. His men fought with more determination, more heart. Slowly, but surely, Julius gained the upper hand. Pompey's forces began to falter, to retreat. And then, they broke. The battle was won. Julius had triumphed. Pompey fled, leaving behind his shattered army. He escaped to Egypt, hoping to find refuge there, but his hopes were in vain. Pompey was betrayed and killed, his death marking the end of the greatest threat to Julius's power. The war was over. Julius was victorious. Julius returned to Rome as a conqueror. The city that had once trembled in fear now welcomed him with open arms. The people celebrated his victory with grand parades, the streets filled with music, with the cheers of the crowd. Julius rode through the city in a golden chariot, the spoils of war displayed for all to see. He was no longer just a general, no longer just a leader. He was the master of Rome. But deep in his heart, Julius knew that his enemies were not gone. They were waiting, plotting. The Senate had been humbled, but not defeated. Many still saw Julius as a threat to the old ways, to the Republic. They whispered in the shadows, their hatred for him growing with each passing day. Julius knew that the victory he had won was not secure. He had taken control of Rome, but holding on to that control would be even harder. The city was full of danger, of plots and schemes. He could feel the tension in the air, the sense that something dark was brewing. But Julius was not a man to be easily intimidated. He had faced danger before, had fought against impossible odds, and won. He knew that to secure his position, he would need to be vigilant and ruthless. He began to take steps to strengthen his power, to ensure that his enemies could not rise against him. Julius started by consolidating his control over the government. He filled the Senate with men who were loyal to him, who would support his decisions. He passed laws that gave him more power, more authority. He took on the title of dictator for life, making it clear that he was the ultimate ruler of Rome. The people still loved him, still saw him as their champion. They cheered his name, celebrated his victories. But in the back of Julius's mind, the shadow of doubt lingered. He knew that power was a dangerous thing, that it could be taken away as easily as it was gained. And so, Julius kept a close watch on those around him. He trusted few, knowing that betrayal could come from anywhere, from anyone. He surrounded himself with loyal supporters, with men who had proven their allegiance to him. But even among his closest allies, Julius knew that there were those who might turn against him, who might see his death as a way to restore the old republic. The city of Rome buzzed with rumors, with whispers of conspiracy. Julius was aware of the danger, but he refused to live in fear. He had fought too hard, come too far, to be brought down by shadows. He would face whatever came with the same courage, the same determination that had carried him through the Civil War. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Julius could feel the tension building. The city that had once celebrated his victories was now a place of uncertainty, of unease. The grand parades, the celebrations had faded away, replaced by the quiet murmur of plots and schemes. Julius Caesar had won the Civil War, but the battle for Rome was far from over. The greatest challenge still lay ahead, hidden in the shadows, waiting to strike. And Julius, ever the soldier, ever the leader, prepared himself for what was to come. He knew that the path he had chosen was a dangerous one, but he was ready to walk it, to the very end. Now, let's see how well you remember the details. I'm going to ask you a few questions about what you've just heard. think carefully about your answers, and when you're ready, write them down in the comments below. Why did the Senate decide to make Julius Caesar dictator for life? What events led to this decision? Chapter 6, Dictator for Life. The Senate had no choice. Julius Caesar had become too powerful to ignore, too influential to oppose. His victories in the Civil War, his popularity with the people, and his unmatched leadership had made him the most powerful man in Rome. The senators, who once ruled Rome with authority, now found themselves overshadowed by Julius's brilliance. They knew they had to make a decision that would change the course of history. In a grand and solemn ceremony, the Senate declared Julius Caesar dictator for life. This title gave him complete control over Rome, making him the supreme ruler. It was an unprecedented move, one that broke the traditions of the Roman Republic. But Julius's power was undeniable, and the Senate had to recognize it, or risk being swept away by it. Julius was at the height of his power. He had achieved his dreams. The boy who had watched soldiers march through the streets of Rome, the young man who had fought bravely in distant lands, had now become the master of the greatest empire in the world. It was a moment of triumph, a moment that filled Julius with a deep sense of accomplishment. As dictator for life, Julius could shape Rome's future as he saw fit. He began to implement his vision, passing laws that he believed would strengthen Rome, bring prosperity to its people, and secure its dominance over the world. He reformed the calendar, introduced new building projects, and provided land to veterans. He sought to make Rome a city of greatness, a city that would stand as a beacon to the world. The people of Rome celebrated Julius's new position. They saw him as their protector, their leader, the man who had brought stability after years of chaos and war. They cheered his name in the streets, honored him with statues, and even named a month after him, July. To many, Julius was not just a leader. He was a hero. But not everyone was happy. In the shadows of Rome's grand buildings, behind the smiles and cheers, there were whispers of discontent, whispers of fear. Some senators were angry, jealous. They had once been the rulers of Rome, the men who made the decisions. Now, they were little more than advisors to Julius, their power diminished, their influence fading. These senators began to grumble, to plot. They believed that Julius wanted to be a king, a title that had been banished from Rome centuries before. Rome had no place for kings. The Republic was founded on the principle that no one man should hold all the power. But now, Julius seemed to be breaking that very principle, taking more and more control for himself. Julius knew that not everyone supported him. He was aware of the envy, the anger that simmered beneath the surface. But he believed in his vision for Rome, believed that what he was doing was for the good of the city, for the good of its people. He did not see himself as a king. He saw himself as a leader who would guide Rome to greatness. But the rumors continued to spread. The senators who opposed Julius began to gather in secret, meeting in dark rooms away from the eyes of the public. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices filled with resentment. They feared that Julius was leading Rome down a dangerous path, a path that would end with the death of the Republic and the rise of a new monarchy. The tension in Rome grew. Julius could feel it in the air, could see it in the eyes of those who once supported him without question. The city that had once celebrated his victories now seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching. Julius knew that he had to be careful, that he had to secure his position, but he also knew that he could not abandon his vision. He was determined to push forward, to continue his work, no matter the opposition. Julius began to make more changes. He filled the Senate with men who were loyal to him, men who would support his decisions, who would help him carry out his plans. He took steps to strengthen his control over the military, ensuring that the legions would remain loyal to him and him alone. Julius was not just a ruler. He was a strategist, always thinking, always planning his next move. But the opposition was growing stronger. The senators who feared Julius's power began to band together, forming a conspiracy against him. They believed that they were saving Rome, that they were protecting the Republic from a man who had become too powerful, too ambitious. They saw themselves as defenders of Rome's traditions, as the last line of defense against tyranny. The leader of this group was a man named Brutus, a senator who had once been close to Julius, a man Julius had trusted. Brutus was torn between his loyalty to Julius and his belief in the Republic. He struggled with his conscience, with the decision he knew he had to make. But in the end, Brutus chose the Republic over his friend, over Julius. The plot was set. The conspirators knew that they had to act quickly, that they had to strike before Julius could take more power, before he could become too strong to stop. They chose the Ides of March, a day that would forever be etched in history, as the day they would carry out their plan. Julius, unaware of the danger that surrounded him, continued with his work, continued with his vision for Rome. He believed that he was on the path to creating a better future, a future where Rome would be the greatest city in the world, where its people would live in peace and prosperity. But as the Ides of March approached, the tension in Rome reached its peak. The conspirators prepared themselves, their hearts filled with fear and resolve. They knew that what they were about to do would change everything, that it would be the end of one era and the beginning of another. Julius Caesar had reached the height of his power. He was dictator for life, the ruler of Rome, the man who had achieved his dreams. But in the shadows, his enemies were gathering, their knives sharpened, their minds set on betrayal. And as the day of destiny drew near, the city of Rome held its breath, waiting for the final act in the drama of Julius Caesar's life. A drama filled with triumphs, with power, and with the dark shadow of betrayal that would soon fall upon him. Before we dive into Chapter 7, just a quick reminder that you're listening to wooEnglish, where we bring history to life through stories to help you learn English. If you're enjoying the journey so far, don't forget to leave a comment and let us know your thoughts. Now, let's continue with the dramatic events of Julius Caesar's life. Chapter 7. The Ides of March. Julius Caesar, a man of destiny, he had risen to the height of power, conquered his enemies, and ruled Rome as its undisputed leader. But with great power came great danger, and the shadows were closing in. Yet, Julius was a man who believed in his fate, in his star. He had faced countless dangers before and had always emerged victorious. He felt invincible, untouchable. But as the Ides of March approached, a sense of unease began to fill the air. Friends and allies, those who cared for Julius, began to worry. Strange omens appeared. Whispers of danger echoed through the streets of Rome. Some claimed to have seen terrible visions in their dreams. Others spoke of dark clouds gathering over the city. But Julius, he brushed these warnings aside. He was Caesar. He had come this far, and nothing could stop him now. Still, the warnings grew louder. The soothsayers, the fortune-tellers, all said the same thing. Beware the Ides of March. But Julius, with a smile, dismissed their fears. He was not afraid of omens. He was not afraid of anything. His destiny was too great, his star too bright. He believed in himself, in his strength, in his power. He believed that nothing could harm him. But deep inside, there was a small, quiet voice, a voice that whispered of danger, of betrayal. Julius felt it, a nagging doubt, a chill in the air. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on his plans, his vision for Rome. But as March 15th drew near, the feeling grew stronger. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible. On the morning of the Ides of March, the sun rose slowly, casting long shadows over the city. Julius woke early, as was his custom. He dressed in his finest robes, the deep red fabric, rich and heavy. He looked at himself in the mirror, straightened his shoulders, and smiled. Today was just another day in the life of Caesar. But as he prepared to leave his home, his wife, Calpurnia, rushed to him, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She had had a terrible dream, a vision of blood and death. She begged Julius to stay at home, to avoid the Senate, just for today. Her voice trembled with desperation. She could feel the danger in the air. But Julius was calm. He took Calpurnia's hand, smiled gently, and reassured her. "My dear," he said, "dreams are just dreams. There is nothing to fear." He kissed her on the forehead and promised that he would return soon. Then, with a final smile, he turned and walked out the door. As Julius stepped into the streets of Rome, the city seemed to come alive around him. People greeted him with respect, with admiration. They called out his name, and he responded with a nod, a smile. But the chill in the air remained. A sense that something was not right. Julius walked towards the Senate, his step steady, his head held high. But with each step, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The streets, once bustling with life, seemed quieter, darker. The people he passed seemed to look at him with a strange mix of reverence and pity, as if they knew something he did not. As he neared the Senate, a soothsayer approached him, his face lined with worry. "Beware the Ides of March," he warned again, his voice urgent. Julius stopped, looked at the man, and with a half-smile replied, "The Ides of March are here." The soothsayer nodded, his eyes dark. "Yes," he said, "but they are not gone." Julius felt a shiver run down his spine, but he shook it off and continued on his way. The Senate building loomed before him, its great stone columns casting long shadows across the ground. As Julius approached the entrance, he hesitated for just a moment, just a heartbeat. The feeling of dread washed over him, stronger than before. But he was Caesar. He would not let fear control him. With a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The Senate chamber was grand, filled with the most powerful men in Rome. They rose as Julius entered, their faces masks of respect and loyalty. But beneath those masks, something darker lurked, something cold and dangerous. Julius could feel it. A tension in the air, a weight pressing down on him. But he pushed it aside, determined to carry on as usual. Julius walked to the center of the chamber, his robes flowing behind him. The senators watched him closely, their eyes following his every move. As he reached his seat, Julius felt a chill, a deep, bone-cold chill. He looked around, but everything seemed normal. And yet, something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The senators began to gather around him, their movements slow, deliberate. Julius looked into their eyes and saw something that made his blood run cold. Hatred, jealousy, fear. The emotions flickered across their faces, barely hidden behind their polite smiles. Julius's heart began to race, the unease that had been building now exploding into full-blown fear. And then it happened. The first blow came suddenly, sharp and unexpected. Julius gasped, the pain shooting through him like fire. He looked down and saw the dagger, its blade glinting in the light, already stained with his blood. He turned, his eyes wide with shock, searching for the face of his attacker, and saw a fellow senator, a man he had trusted. Julius staggered, trying to comprehend what was happening. But before he could react, more daggers flashed, more blows rained down on him. The senators, the men he had once called friends, were attacking him. The chamber was filled with the sounds of steel slicing through flesh, of feet shuffling on the marble floor, of heavy, panicked breathing. Julius tried to defend himself, tried to fight back, but there were too many hands, too many blades. He was surrounded, overwhelmed. The pain was unbearable, the betrayal cutting deeper than any dagger. Julius fell to his knees, his vision blurring, his strength draining away. And then he saw him, Brutus. The man Julius had trusted above all others, the man he had loved like a son. Brutus stood over him, his eyes filled with sorrow and resolve. Julius looked up, his heart breaking, and whispered the words that would echo through history. Et tu, Brute? And you, Brutus? With that final heartbreaking question, Julius fell. His life slipping away, his dreams shattered, his destiny fulfilled. The great Julius Caesar, the man who had conquered Rome, who had changed the course of history, was no more. The senators stood over him, their hands stained with blood, their faces filled with a mix of triumph and horror. The Ides of March had come, and with it, the end of an era. The world had changed, and Rome would never be the same again. Chapter 8. The Betrayal. Julius Caesar sat in the Senate, the grand chamber filled with men he thought were his allies, his friends. The room buzzed with discussion, the marble walls echoing with the voices of Rome's most powerful men. Julius, now dictator for life, had come to the Senate expecting another day of politics, of decisions that would shape Rome's future. He had no idea that this day would be his last. The atmosphere was different, tense. Julius could sense it, though he tried to ignore the feeling. These men, the senators, had supported him, or so he believed. They had cheered for him, raised him to the highest position in Rome. Yet today, there was something in their eyes, something cold, something dark. Julius shifted in his seat, his instincts telling him that something was wrong. But what? He was Caesar, the most powerful man in the world. Who would dare to challenge him? He pushed the thoughts aside, reminding himself that he was in control. He had fought wars, faced countless enemies, and emerged victorious. But this was different. As the meeting continued, Julius noticed the senators moving closer, their expressions growing more serious. They surrounded him slowly, like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. Julius felt the first flicker of fear. A fear he hadn't felt in years. But he remained calm, his face betraying nothing. Then, it happened. A sudden flash of steel, a sharp pain in his side. Julius gasped, his eyes wide with shock. One of the senators had plunged a dagger into him. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Julius stared at the man who had stabbed him. Disbelief washing over him like a cold wave. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But it was. Before he could react, another senator struck, and then another. The room erupted in chaos as Julius tried to defend himself, tried to stand, but the blows kept coming. Relentless, brutal. Each stab was filled with hatred, each thrust a betrayal. The men he had trusted, the men he had called friends, were now turning on him with savage fury. Julius struggled to fight back, his hands grasping at the air, at his attackers. But there were too many of them. The pain was unbearable, his body weakening with each blow. He looked around, desperate for help, for mercy. But all he saw were cold eyes, hard faces, men consumed by their own fear and jealousy. And then he saw him, Brutus, the man Julius had loved like a son, the man he had trusted above all others. Brutus stood there, dagger in hand, his face pale, his eyes filled with sorrow. Julius's heart shattered in that moment. The betrayal was too much, too deep. How could Brutus, his beloved Brutus, be part of this? With the last of his strength, Julius reached out to him, his voice choked with pain and disbelief. "Et tu, Brute," he whispered, "and you, Brutus." The words were filled with the weight of 1,000 betrayals, the sorrow of a man who had lost everything in a single, terrible moment. Brutus hesitated, his face contorted with guilt, but then he struck, the final blow. Julius felt the dagger pierce his chest, and with it, his last bit of strength left him. His body collapsed, crumpling to the cold marble floor. The room spun around him, the world fading away as darkness closed in. Julius lay there, his breath shallow, his vision dimming. The senators stood over him, their daggers dripping with his blood, their faces a mixture of triumph and horror. They had done it. They had killed Caesar. But in the silence that followed, as Julius's life slipped away, they realized the enormity of their crime. The man who had ruled Rome, who had led armies and conquered lands, was gone, and with him, a part of Rome itself. As Julius took his final breath, his thoughts turned to everything he had accomplished, everything he had lost. He had dreamed of greatness, of power, of a Rome that would last forever. But in the end, it was not an enemy from afar who had brought him down. It was those he had trusted most, The Senate chamber was deathly silent now, the air heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. Julius Caesar, the man who had been like a god among men, was dead. His blood stained the marble floor, a stark reminder of the price of power, of the dangers of ambition. And as the senators slowly backed away, their footsteps echoing in the vast chamber, the words "et tu, Brute" seemed to linger in the air, a haunting reminder of the betrayal that had brought down one of the greatest men in history. Julius Caesar was gone, but his legacy and the story of his tragic end would live on. The world would remember this day, this act of betrayal, and the fall of a man who had reached the heights of power, only to be struck down by those he had trusted most. Chapter 9. The Fall of a Leader. Rome was silent, shocked. The news spread quickly through the city like a cold wind that chilled everyone who heard it. Julius Caesar, the greatest leader Rome had ever known, was dead. The man who had led Rome to victory, who had brought stability to the Republic, who had been loved by the people, was gone. The Senate chamber, where Julius had taken his last breath, was now eerily quiet. The men who had killed him stood there, their hands still stained with his blood, their faces pale with the realization of what they had done. They had thought they were saving Rome. They believed they were heroes, defenders of the Republic. But as they looked at the lifeless body of Julius Caesar lying on the cold marble floor, they began to doubt. Had they really saved Rome? Or had they just brought about its destruction? Outside, the city was frozen in a state of disbelief. The streets, usually full of life and energy, were now hushed. People gathered in small groups, whispering to each other, their faces filled with fear and sorrow. How could this have happened? How could Julius Caesar, the man who seemed invincible, be dead? The news hit the people of Rome like a thunderbolt. They had loved Julius, admired him, trusted him. He was the leader who had brought them victories, who had expanded Rome's borders, who had made their city the most powerful in the world. They remembered his strength, his courage, his vision for Rome. And now, he was gone. It was as if the very heart of Rome had been ripped out. In the days that followed, the city was plunged into mourning. Everywhere, people wept for Julius. They cried for their lost leader, their fallen hero. The streets were filled with the sound of lamentation, with the grief of a people who had lost not just a leader, but a father, a protector. The markets were quiet, the temples full of those praying for Julius's soul. Rome was a city in mourning. The people gathered in the Forum, the heart of Roman public life, to pay their respects. They brought flowers, wreaths, and offerings, laying them at the feet of statues of Julius Caesar. They spoke of his victories, of the battles he had won, of the peace he had brought to Rome. They remembered his speeches, his words that had inspired them, that had made them believe in a greater future for their city. But beneath the sorrow, there was also anger, a deep, simmering rage. The people of Rome could not understand why Julius had been killed. He had been their champion, their hero. How could the Senate, those men who were supposed to serve the people, have done this? The whispers of betrayal, of conspiracy, began to grow louder. The men who had killed Julius thought they had saved Rome, but instead they had unleashed a storm of chaos and fury. The senators who had conspired against Julius tried to defend their actions. They claimed that they had acted to save the Republic, to prevent Julius from becoming a king, from destroying the freedoms that Rome had cherished for centuries. But their words fell on deaf ears. The people did not care about their justifications, their excuses. They wanted justice for Julius. They wanted revenge. The city became a cauldron of tension, ready to boil over. Fights broke out in the streets. Mobs formed, demanding the heads of those responsible for Julius's death. The once proud Senate was now a place of fear, its members afraid to show their faces in public. The men who had killed Julius had believed they were saving Rome, but they had only brought it to the brink of civil war. And in the midst of this chaos, there was one figure who stood out, who seemed to embody the grief and anger of the people. Mark Antony, a close friend and ally of Julius Caesar, was determined to see that justice was done. He spoke out against the conspirators, calling them murderers, traitors. His voice rang out in the forum, powerful and full of emotion, stirring the hearts of those who listened. Antony organized a grand funeral for Julius, a spectacle that would forever be etched in the memory of the Roman people. The streets were filled with mourners, thousands of people coming together to say their final goodbyes. Julius's body was carried through the city, draped in the finest cloth, his face serene, as if he were merely sleeping. The people wept as they watched, their hearts breaking at the sight of their fallen leader. And then came the moment that would change everything. Mark Antony stood before the gathered crowd, holding up Julius Caesar's blood-stained toga. His voice, filled with sorrow and anger, echoed through the forum as he spoke of Julius's greatness, of his love for Rome, of the betrayal that had taken his life. He pointed to the tears in the toga, the places where the knives had struck, and named each of the conspirators. The crowd listened in stunned silence, their grief turning into fury. Antony's words were like a spark in dry tinder. The crowd erupted in anger, their grief transforming into a desire for vengeance. They shouted curses against the senators, against Brutus and the others who had betrayed Julius. The streets of Rome, once filled with mourning, now became battlegrounds as the people sought out those they blamed for their loss. The city descended into chaos. The men who had killed Julius Caesar, once powerful and respected, were now hunted, reviled. They had thought they could control Rome, but they had only unleashed its fury. The Republic they claimed to save was now crumbling, torn apart by the very people they had sought to protect. In the end, Julius Caesar's death did not save Rome. It destroyed it. The Republic that had stood for centuries, that had been the pride of Rome, was now in ruins. And from those ruins, a new power would rise. One that would forever change the course of history. But for the people of Rome, there was only sorrow. They had lost their leader, their hero, and with him, a part of their city's soul. They would never forget Julius Caesar, the man who had brought them greatness, and whose death had plunged them into darkness. Rome was silent, mourning the fall of a leader who had once been its greatest hope. Chapter 10. The Rise of Octavian. But the story did not end with Julius Caesar's death. Far from it. The man who had reshaped Rome left behind a legacy and a successor. His adopted son, Octavian, was just a teenager when Julius was killed. But the shock of that brutal day changed him forever. Octavian was young, but his heart burned with a fire of determination. He vowed to avenge Julius and bring justice to Rome, no matter the cost. Octavian was not a soldier, not yet a leader, but he was smart, very smart. He knew that to succeed in a world as dangerous as Rome, he would need allies, and he would need to act quickly. The death of Julius Caesar had thrown Rome into chaos, with old loyalties shattered and new powers rising. The Senate was weak, the people were angry, and Rome was on the brink of another civil war. Octavian knew that if he was going to succeed, he would have to be bold. He would have to take risks that others might shy away from. He began by rallying the supporters of Julius, those who were still loyal to the memory of his father. He spoke to the soldiers, to the people, to anyone who would listen. He promised them that he would continue Julius's work, that he would bring peace and stability back to Rome. But Octavian was not alone in his quest for power. There were others who sought to control Rome, men like Mark Antony, one of Julius Caesar's closest allies, and Lepidus, a powerful general. These men saw Octavian as a boy, inexperienced and weak. They thought they could use him, manipulate him. But they were wrong. Octavian formed an alliance with Antony and Lepidus, creating what would become known as the Second Triumvirate. Together, they were powerful, more powerful than any other force in Rome. But even as they worked together, Octavian knew that this alliance was temporary. He knew that one day he would have to face Antony and defeat him. The triumvirate's first task was to punish the men who had killed Julius Caesar. They hunted down the conspirators, those who had betrayed and murdered their leader. Brutus, Cassius, and the others tried to fight back, but they were no match for the might of the triumvirate. One by one, they were defeated. Justice was done. Julius Caesar was avenged. But Rome was not yet at peace. The alliance between Octavian and Antony began to crack. Antony was powerful, popular, and had the loyalty of many soldiers, but Octavian was patient, calculating. He knew that his time would come, and when it did, he would have to strike hard and fast. Antony made a critical mistake. He became involved with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, and began to spend more and more time away from Rome. The people of Rome, already suspicious of foreign influence, began to turn against him. They saw Antony as a traitor, someone who cared more for Egypt than for Rome. Octavian seized this opportunity. He used Antony's relationship with Cleopatra to turn the Senate and the people against him. He painted Antony as an enemy of Rome, a man who had betrayed his own country for the love of a foreign queen. The people, already angry and disillusioned, rallied behind Octavian. They saw him as the true defender of Rome, the man who would restore the greatness that Julius had once brought. The final conflict between Octavian and Antony came at the Battle of Actium, a great naval battle that would decide the future of Rome. Octavian, now a skilled and seasoned leader, commanded his forces with precision and determination. Antony and Cleopatra fought desperately, but they were no match for Octavian's strategy and the loyalty of his troops. The battle was fierce, the sea filled with the sounds of war, but in the end, Octavian was victorious. With Antony and Cleopatra defeated, there was no one left to challenge Octavian. He returned to Rome not just as a conqueror, but as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The Senate, now fully under his control, granted him a new title, Augustus. He was no longer just Octavian, he was Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Under Augustus, Rome entered a new era, a time of peace and prosperity known as the Pax Romana. He built on Julius Caesar's legacy, strengthening the empire, reforming the government, and expanding Rome's borders. The city that had once been torn apart by civil war was now united under a single leader, a leader who had proven himself through determination, intelligence, and strength. Augustus was more than just a ruler. He was the architect of an empire that would last for centuries. He established a system of government that brought stability to Rome, a stability that allowed the arts, culture, and economy to flourish. The people of Rome, who had once been afraid of the future, now looked forward with hope. But Augustus never forgot where he'd come from. He never forgot the man who had inspired him, the man who had been like a father to him, Julius Caesar. Everything Augustus did, every decision he made, was guided by the memory of Julius. He wanted to honor his legacy, to ensure that the dreams Julius had for Rome were fulfilled. And so, Augustus ruled wisely, balancing power with mercy, strength with wisdom. He knew that to keep Rome strong, he had to be more than just a conqueror. He had to be a leader that the people could trust, that they could believe in. And he was. The people loved Augustus, respected him, and saw in him the spirit of Julius Caesar. Rome had changed. It was no longer a republic, but an empire that would grow to dominate the known world, an empire that would leave a legacy that lasted long after Augustus himself was gone. And it all began with a young man named Octavian, who had the courage to rise from the shadow of his adopted father and create a new era for Rome. Augustus's reign marked the end of the turmoil that had plagued Rome for so long. Under his rule, the city flourished, and its people prospered. The empire he built would endure for centuries, becoming one of the most powerful and influential civilizations in history. Chapter 11. The Legend of Julius Caesar. Years passed, but the memory of Julius Caesar lived on. Rome had changed. The city had grown and flourished under the rule of Augustus and the emperors who followed. But even as new leaders came and went, the name of Julius Caesar remained on the lips of the people. He had become more than just a man. He had become a legend. In the streets of Rome, in the marketplaces and the temples, people told stories of Julius Caesar. They spoke of his bravery on the battlefield, of the way he led his soldiers with courage and determination. They remembered how he crossed the Rubicon, defying the Senate, choosing his destiny over safety. "The die is cast," he had said, and with those words, he had changed the course of history. The young listened with wide eyes as the elders recounted tales of Caesar's ambition, of his rise from a noble family to become the most powerful man in Rome. They spoke of his wisdom, of the reforms he brought, of how he cared for the people, giving them land and food, building great monuments that still stood tall. Julius Caesar was not just a leader. He was a hero, a man who had the vision and the strength to reshape the world. But the stories were not just of his triumphs. The people also remembered the tragedy of his death, the day when the light of Rome was snuffed out by the very men he had trusted. The Ides of March, the day that would forever be remembered as the moment when Rome lost its greatest leader. Et tu, Brute? The words echoed through time, a haunting reminder of betrayal, of the fragility of power. Yet, even in death, Julius Caesar's influence grew. He became a symbol of power, of leadership, of what it meant to be truly great. The senators who had plotted against him believed they were saving Rome, but instead, they had ensured that Caesar would be remembered forever. His name was spoken with respect, with awe. To be compared to Caesar was the highest praise. It meant you were strong, wise, destined for greatness. The image of Julius Caesar was everywhere. In statues, in paintings, in the very fabric of Roman life. His face was chiseled into marble, his deeds written into the annals of history. The coins that bore his likeness were treasured, passed down from generation to generation. He was a man, but he was also an idea that lived on long after he was gone. People from all over the empire came to Rome to see the places where Caesar had walked, where he had spoken, where he had fought. They visited the Senate where he had been betrayed, the Forum where he had addressed the crowds, the temples where he had prayed to the gods. They stood in awe of the greatness that had once been, and that still lingered in the air. But Julius Caesar's legacy was not confined to Rome alone. His influence spread across the known world. Leaders in distant lands studied his strategies, his speeches, his laws. They wanted to be like Caesar, to command respect, to wield power, to be remembered. His name crossed borders, crossed oceans, becoming a symbol of what a leader could be. Historians wrote of his life, of his conquests, of the way he had transformed Rome from a republic into an empire. They debated his motives, his actions, his legacy. Was he a hero? Was he a tyrant? The discussions went on, but one thing was certain. Julius Caesar had changed the course of history. Without him, Rome might have remained a republic, or it might have fallen into chaos. With him, it became the center of the world, an empire that would last for centuries. As the years turned into decades, and the decades into centuries, the legend of Julius Caesar only grew stronger. He became a figure of myth, almost godlike in his power and influence. People looked to him as the ultimate example of leadership, of what it meant to seize control of your destiny. His life became a story told to inspire, to teach, to remind people of the heights that one could reach and the dangers that came with such power. Even today, people remember Julius Caesar. His name is still spoken with respect, with awe. He is studied in schools, his life a lesson in ambition, in courage, in the complexities of power. Leaders across the world continue to look to him as a model, trying to capture even a fraction of the greatness that he embodied. In literature, in art, in politics, the shadow of Julius Caesar looms large. He is the standard against which all other leaders are measured. The phrase Caesar has come to represent authority, dominance, the ability to command respect. And the story of his life, from his rise to power to his tragic fall, continues to captivate the imagination of people everywhere. But perhaps the greatest testament to Julius Caesar's legacy is the way he continues to inspire. People hear his story and are moved to action, to pursue their own dreams with the same determination, the same fearlessness that he did. They learn from his successes and from his mistakes. They are reminded that greatness comes with a cost, that power is never secure, and that true leadership requires more than just strength. It requires wisdom, vision, and the ability to inspire others. The story of Julius Caesar is not just a story of a man, but of an idea that anyone, no matter their beginnings, can rise to greatness if they have the will, the courage, and the vision to do so. It is a story that will never be forgotten, a story that will continue to be told as long as people seek to understand what it means to lead, to aspire, to achieve. Chapter 12. The Lesson of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar's life teaches us many things. It is a story full of triumph and tragedy, of dreams and dangers, of power and betrayal. As we look back on his life, we see not just a man, but a symbol of what it means to reach for greatness and the costs that come with it. Julius was a man of incredible ambition. From a young age, he dreamed of power, of making his mark on the world. He watched the soldiers in the streets of Rome, the leaders in the Senate, and he knew. He wanted to be one of them. But not just any leader. The greatest leader Rome had ever known. His ambition drove him to great heights. He was brave on the battlefield, cunning in politics, and wise in his decisions. He won the loyalty of his soldiers, the love of the people, and the fear of his enemies. Julius was unstoppable. He climbed the ladder of power, each step bringing him closer to his ultimate goal. But as Julius rose, so did the dangers around him. Power is a double-edged sword. On one side, it brings success and control, but on the other, it brings jealousy, fear, and enemies. Julius's ambition made him powerful, but it also made him vulnerable. The more he gained, the more he had to lose, and the more others wanted to bring him down. Julius's life shows us the power of ambition. It is a force that can drive us to achieve great things, to break boundaries, to change the world. But ambition alone is not enough. It must be balanced with wisdom, with humility, and with an understanding of the dangers it brings. As Julius gained more power, he began to make enemies. Some were jealous of his success. Others feared that he was becoming too powerful, that he was turning Rome from a republic into a kingdom. They whispered behind his back, plotted in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Julius was aware of the dangers, but he believed in his destiny. He believed he was untouchable. But no one is untouchable. The Ides of March, the day that would go down in history as the day Julius Caesar fell. The men he trusted, the men he thought were his allies, turned against him. They attacked him in the Senate, stabbing him again and again, each blow filled with hatred and fear. And in that moment, Julius realized the painful truth. The higher you rise, the further you have to fall. The lesson of Julius Caesar's fall is clear. The dangers of too much power are real. Power can blind us, make us think we are invincible. It can make us forget the people around us, the people who might see our power as a threat. Julius was a man of great vision, but his ambition, unchecked, led to his downfall. He did not see the danger until it was too late. And then there is the pain of betrayal, the deepest wound of all. Julius was not just betrayed by anyone, but by those closest to him, those he loved and trusted. The betrayal of Brutus, the man he considered a son, cut deeper than any dagger. Et tu, Brute? Those were the last words Julius spoke, words that echoed with the pain of a broken heart. Betrayal is a lesson we learn from Julius Caesar's life. It reminds us that trust is a fragile thing, that even those we hold dear can turn against us. It teaches us to be careful, to be wise in choosing our friends and allies. But it also shows us the cost of betrayal, the way it can destroy not just lives, but dreams, and even the course of history. But in the end, Julius Caesar's legacy is not just a story of war, power, and betrayal. It is also a story of vision, of daring to dream. Julius was a man who looked at the world and saw what it could be. He saw a Rome that was greater, stronger, and more powerful than ever before. He had the courage to chase that dream, to take risks, to defy the odds. Julius Caesar changed the world. His actions led to the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. His reforms, his conquests, his leadership shaped the course of history. And even though he fell, even though his life was cut short by betrayal, his spirit, his story, lives on. We remember Julius Caesar not just as a man who was brought down by his enemies, but as a man who dared to rise in the first place. He teaches us that dreams are worth pursuing, that ambition can lead to greatness, but also that power must be handled with care. His life is a reminder that with great power comes great responsibility and great risks. But perhaps the most important lesson we learn from Julius Caesar is this: even when we fall, even when our lives are cut short, our dreams, our actions, our legacy can live on. Julius's vision for Rome did not die with him. It was carried on by his successors, by the people who believed in him, by the city he loved. His name became a symbol of power, of leadership, of ambition. Julius Caesar's story is not just a story of one man, but of what it means to be human, to dream, to strive, to rise, to fall, and to leave a mark on the world. It is a story that will never be forgotten, because it is a story that lives in all of us. The desire to achieve greatness, the fear of failure, the pain of betrayal, and the hope that our actions will make a difference. In the end, Julius Caesar's life is a lesson in the power of vision, the dangers of unchecked ambition, and the resilience of the human spirit. His story is a reminder that while we may fall, our dreams can endure, our legacy can live on. And that is the true power of Julius Caesar, a power that will continue to inspire and teach for generations to come.